went to, and it's not quite in order. I'm going a little bit out of order because I wanted to kind of do it with Luther's life order more than than where we went specifically. So there'll be some jumping back and forth of the trip. That won't matter to you. I was just letting you know, like, we didn't do this perfectly as it is presented. And we'll get as far as we can on this. This one's a much longer. There's about 200 slides, so we'll split this one up, maybe into 2, maybe into 3 classes. We'll see how where the conversation goes. But good morning, welcome in. And so today we're going to really talk about Luther's life and and just some touristy things about the historical things that we saw as witnesses to this Lutherland trip. So here we go. Let's get started. So where does our trip begin? In Luther's life chronologically. Does anyone know where Luther was born? That's right. Well, so yeah. Welcome to the Lutherstadt Eisleben. So this is where the bus dropped us off. Now, here's the funny thing. Lutherstadt means Luther City. Do you know how many Lutherstadts there are? Several. Everyone claims to be the Luther City, but it is what it is. But this is where Luther was born. So this is the house that Luther was born in. So we walk down this old street, and so here is like a little chapel, and that wasn't there when Luther was born. This building right here that we're standing in front of right here, this little courtyard entry is old, but it's not to the time of Luther. This would have been the original structure of Luther's house where he was born. However, this burnt down many years ago. This is a reconstruction. So where Luther was actually born is gone. Of course, fire is rampant in Europe, especially in the Middle Ages. So most things are either renovated or restored. Very few things are literally the thing we see. But, still, with that being said, for this location is real, is where Luther was born, and the house was reconstructed. And that's just a better view of the house straight on. I like the windows and everything, and just a construction to a Middle Ages German home. Now, what do you notice about this house? It was kind of nice, right? It was big, yeah. This is Luther's parents, Hans and Marguerite. Luther was born to Hans here, Hans Luda. His name is not originally Luther. Who knew that? You did not? Okay, so originally their family name was Luda. Now, who knows what Luda means? No. L-U-D-A? L-U-D-E-R. Luder. Yeah, Luda. Yeah. So, Luther changes his name a little bit later in life, but when he's in college, and he does it. He uses a Greek translation or a Greek alliteration of his name. So Luther, L-U-T-H-E-R, is a Greek, and that was a very popular thing for people who were scholastically inclined, people who were at the university, to change their name into either ancient Greek or Latin or Hebrew. And the reason they did this is for several reasons, but one, at the time when Luther was going to, and we'll get to this in a second, but when Luther was in university, he was going to study the law. and he was studying law. And if you were going to be a lawyer, you didn't want a last name Luder, because Luder means something inappropriate in German, something you might call a female dog. And seriously, so he was like, well, we gotta change that. So he changes it to the Greek form of Luther. And he's not the only one. It's a very contemporary thing to do. Most people in the Middle Ages would change their name 2 to 3 times within their life, especially if they got famous. Not that much different than today, but different than today, they would usually have some kind of scholastic origin. But at any rate, this is Hans and Marguerite Luther. That big house, that was a big house. For the Middle Ages, that's a huge house. Hans, do we know what Hans did? He became rich with mining. So he was a miner. And he was a very wealthy merchant, and he wanted his son to study law. He wanted his children to do well. So when we get into the later part of Luther's story, you can see why Hans is not happy that Luther becomes a monk. So silver and copper. Yeah, I think it's mostly silver. Now, when you go into there's the museum here that's inside. I'm trying to, I can't believe it works sometimes when it wants to. Anyway, here's the museum that's inside the house that Luther was born in. Here's this. This is not obviously contemporary, but a nice little statue of Luther that was hung outside of the place. This is the kitchen. Looks real inviting and homey, right? That is a reproduction, obviously, but it's done quite historically. So this is all from the museum inside Luther's house that he was born in. This used to hang on the wall, and it was. This is the only surviving piece from a contemporary of Martin Luther's time for the house. So in the fire, and here's the legend, this is the only piece that didn't burn. And it stays from the original time of Luther. Now obviously it was painted after Luther was already famous and had probably already passed away. We don't know when exactly it was painted, but it is a contemporary of Luther. So, but the legend is the fire did not touch the welcoming portrait of the great Dr. Martin. The truth was they had taken it down to restore it a little bit because it had gotten kind of dirty, and it was in a different place when the fire burned the house down. But hey, why let the truth get in the way of a good story, right? And these windows are later, but they are also. It's again, they're not reproductions. They are original to the time they were made. They are not contemporary of Luther, but they are still very old, somewhere around 1620, something like that. So again, much older than pretty much anything we got around here. So that's some of those fun things. His birth date is November 10th, I forgot. 83, something like that? Let me look it up. I don't remember his birth. I remember the date, November 10th. Or October 10th. What did I say? Yeah. Let me look. I forgot. Again, I had it memorized at one point. Yeah, 10th of November, 1483. So I had it right. My memory was right. And then he died 18th of February, 1546. Yeah, so he lived a long time for someone of his era and of someone of his reputation. You know, heretics don't last long usually, right? So, in Catholicism. So, we'll get to that as well. Let's see what we got next. So on the upper floor of Luther's birth house, it's the coolest museum that I think. I loved it. The art there was amazing. This is a wood panel that would have sat above like an archway. And so it was this giant thing, and I wanted to get a close-up because these are contemporaries of Luther. They really probably wouldn't have known each other, but still it's one of those things, rich and famous people get their face painted next to the big, it's kind of how it goes. So this would have been this beautiful archway. You have the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. You see them, again, it's a biblical text, but it's also like with imagery of the reformers being put in. This is very textbook kind of thing. Do you see the little people are being burned? That's kind of the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They're not being burnt, but they're painted as contemporary German reformers. And all the faces would have been of famous people. Again, some of the art that we see. Now, this is interesting. So these items came out of St. Peter and Paul's church here in Eisleben. This is the original altar piece. When you go into most German, especially Lutheran churches, you'll see like a decorated altar, because again, they would have closed up and opened up for the Eucharist. So, and even though they didn't really do that anymore, they would have a separate tabernacle or a sacristy or anything like that. The tradition kind of stuck that you would have these paneled, beautiful altar pieces. And so when we see some of the churches, you'll see the ones that are there now, but this is original to the time of Luther. So obviously they want to save that from being touched, so they put it in the museum. And here, this is, who knows what does this look like? Well, yeah, it's a crucifix, but what is this whole thing? It is a chasuble, the thing the priest would wear. I wear a chasuble once every 7 years because they're hot. But I'm kidding. That's not true. But something you can wear if you are presiding over Eucharist. And that is again a contemporary piece. Some more of the artwork. All right, so here are the windows right here. These windows would have looked out over Eisleben. This is from Luther's house, but I took this picture because this here is St. Peter and Paul's church. That's how close they were to the church. Now, another sign of how rich you were. The richer you were, the closer to the church you were, right? So this is literally like this building and then another house, and then here's the church. So the Luthers would have had an easy walk to the congregation that they worshipped at. And why is St. Peter and Paul so important to us? Because this is the church that Luther was baptized in. He was baptized in 1483 in this church. Yeah. Remember, that's a very Catholic thing, especially a Middle Ages thing. Infants did not live long. You had to really get to it. St. Peter and Paul's. St. Peter's and Paul's. Now, this is their font now. It's a very cool design. They wanted to make baptism obviously very important to the church. Being the site where Luther was baptized, this is obviously very new. They would not have had something like that, but it's pretty cool to have that kind of a font in a Lutheran church. But this right here, So again, the concrete structure, I am almost 100% sure is more contemporary, but it is the basin that came out. This is this metal basin was in a much older baptismal font that's back in the back that is secured. They took the basin out, put it into this, and this is where Luther was baptized, again, 1483. Now, the wonderful thing about this part of the trip is because where they were going to was a little bit of a steep climb, and my lupus had been acting up, my hips were hurting that day, I did not go with them up to the high Catholic cathedral up on the hill. I did not know at the time that this is the church that Luther was baptized in. I stayed back because we hadn't even gone into the museum yet. I was closer to the buses, and I was just wandering by myself. Don't do that in Europe, but like if you're 6'4" and look like me, you could probably get by with it. And Eisleben was not a touristy place. There was hardly anyone around. It was a Sunday morning, I think. And so, the church hadn't begun yet. I got in there by myself. I was in that church alone. I got to pray. I found out later through the person who let me in that, this is where Luther was baptized. And we said, she's like, "You're a Lutheran pastor?" I was like, "Yeah." Well, hey, it was a really good experience. Anyway, I got to kind of hang out there by myself for a little bit, and then Ashley finally found me, and then later on, some of the people were like, "What is this place?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's the church." And they're like, "How long have you been here?" I was like, "Oh, a while." But I got to pray in here, and it was a very important thing for me. So that's what I was talking about, the altarpiece. See how these almost all of the German churches, especially from this time period, had these beautiful altarpieces. This one is obviously a wood carving to model the one we saw. The original one obviously still being in the museum, but this one is kind of like trying to recreate it. Not like it wasn't like a complete reproduction, but it's an inspired by kind of piece. But this is still wonderful, lovely. The windows are old, but not Martin Luther old. And here's a contemporary piece. We all know who this is. Who is this? Nope. It is Luther's right hand man. Yep, Melanchthon. So again, did you really? Was that his whole? Oh, what? No, his name was Thomas Melanchthon. So it wasn't. Yeah. So Philip Melanchthon. Yeah, Philip Thomas Melanchthon. Yeah. So Philip. My bad. Yeah. Martin Luther. Was his name Martin? Luther Eck. Yeah, Philip Melanchthon. Thomas Melanchthon. What am I talking about? Philip Melanchthon. Again, his last name is a Greek. Yeah, a Greek alliteration. And in Germany they all call him Melanchthon. Melanchthon is that Greek translation because his name was something like Schwarzblatter or something like that. And so he translated into Greek because again it's like something like black cloth or something like that. And so Melanchthon sounded much better than like Schwarzblatter. Something I can't remember exactly what it was, but that's something funny that he didn't like. So he changed his name. But Luther is kind of the energy and the spirit behind the Reformation. Melanchthon is the person who is like actually does most of the writing and the dogma stuff. They're both incredibly brilliant professors. Melanchthon got to know Luther at the university that they taught at, even before the Reformation. he was a very small guy, and so they thought he was one of the students. No, he's one of the doctors, and so it was this whole running thing. But they stay friends their whole life. And he's Melanchthon wrote most of the Augsburg Confession. Luther, again, being theologian and pastor, Melanchthon is actually the scholar who actually does a lot of the work of the Reformation. So, again. This is the roof of, so obviously the St. Peter's and Paul's, when Luther was baptized, was a Catholic cathedral. After the Reformation, architecture becomes important. You want to remove a lot of the gilded stuff. Most Protestant churches are painted white. You want to remove most of the distractions that Gothic cathedrals had, because if you remember the cathedral in Mainz, there's all these statues everywhere of all these bishops, and there's gold everywhere, and there's there's a lot of busyness inside of a cathedral of a Catholic church. Protestants wanted to kind of remove all, they called it adiaphora, anything that wasn't religiously significant to the church, and so you see a very stark contrast between a Protestant church and a Catholic church, but they had some flourishes, and it's still beautiful. Like the architecture is still beautiful and everything. So they didn't want to remove any of the beautiful architecture, but they did want to highlight, the Protestant ideals within the architecture. Again, when people couldn't read, when most people could not read, how do you pass on a message? It's through art. So either music, so hymns were very important to the Lutheran Reformation, and the religious art. So this is the ceiling, and I'll get a close-up on it right here. So here's Luther's seal in the center. So Luther creates his seal when he is a professor in the university before the Reformation. He does this because every professor has to have a seal. So he made one up. This is on the ceiling. I stood in the center of the church like. It's about 60 feet up. It's pretty high. So, next we move here to Eisenach. Now, I didn't take many pictures in Eisenach because there wasn't a whole lot. This is, again, I'm not going in chronological order of our trip, but this is where Luther stayed when he was a schoolboy, a young person. Plague was happening a lot during Luther's time, and so they had to jump around different places. But because his father was wealthy, they could do that. So Luther is in Eisenach at the time. This is about 1498 to about 1480 something, 90 something to about 15 something. His schoolboy age, what we would probably call elementary school. He stays in this home in Eisenach. Now, Eisenach is really important to the Reformation story later in Luther's life, because above the city of Eisenach sits Wartburg Castle. And we'll get to Wartburg Castle here in a minute. So this is why we're in Eisenach. This house was not all that, it was fine. But how much did he actually live there? We don't know. He was a schoolboy there, sure. What you start to find out is, in Germany, there's a lot of Luther houses. They're like, oh, this is Luther's house. And we're like, oh, really? And he was like, yeah, Luther stayed here for 7 days, over a span of 7 months. Yeah, and you're just like, all right, I guess I'm going to go get a croissant now. We're good. Yeah. He came here, he slept here for 4 days, and then he said he hated it here forever. And they're saying these things, but it's true. One of them was Schmalkalden. He was there for only a few days. He had kidney stones so bad he thought he was going to die. He's like, I'm going to go home to die. They put him in a cart, and I guess the road was so bad, the stone actually broke up and passed, and so it just felt like him leaving Schmalkalden cured him, and so he never went back. And I was like, and that's why we're here? Okay. Good story, again. And no, that's not why we're in Schmalkalden, but I'll get to that too later. That's later in his life. So this is Eisenach. Also, Eisenach is important, and I'll show you on another lesson, because it's not really pertinent to Luther, but this is where this is where Johann Sebastian Bach had his house, was where he was born. There's where the museum was. So at any rate, Eisenach is still important. We do spend time in Eisenach, but not too much to the Lutheran story, except for Wartburg Castle, which we have to get to later, because Luther went birth, schoolboy, elementary age to Erfurt. Erfurt is the next big step in Luther's life, because this is where he goes to university. This is where he goes to study the law. And while in Erfurt, in studying law, he gets really fond of all things scholastic and the life in Erfurt. And you know what? I get it. Erfurt is beautiful. I loved Erfurt. If you ever have a chance to go to Germany, make Erfurt on the list, because it is a gorgeous town. I did not know that. I knew the historical importance of Erfurt, but I did not know how pretty it was. So this is the university that Luther attends. This is the university in Erfurt. This is where he studies law, not where he studies theology, but where he studies law. These beautiful, this is like just through the back, this is the backside of a neighborhood, like cutting through gardens. That's just like a sidewalk, and I thought it was beautiful. And we kept going over these little tiny bridges over these little streams. And so this right here, this is actually their main market street, and it's one of those medieval bridges that were businesses and houses. So people would live here, and they would have shops here. And there would be multiple families sometimes living in these houses. And this is all over a bridge on the main street of the town. So this goes through the entire town of Erfurt, leading from the city gate to the big cathedrals in the center of town. Now the reason we are taking this little back path, this hidden little back path, is because this day we showed up in Erfurt. We did not know. The tour guide did not tell us. We had no clue. I don't think they knew that there was a celebration in Erfurt that week called Catholics Day. And something like 40,000 Catholics showed up to Erfurt. And Erfurt is usually a city of about, 250,000. And they just added 40,000 new people for this giant festival that was happening. So the streets were filled with Catholics. And we know that because they were all wearing their little mission trip pilgrimage things. They would tie little scarves on the stuff, and they had them on them. So it was kind of funny that we're there to do this big Lutheran thing for us, and it's in 40,000 Catholics celebrating being Catholic, and we were like, hi. And they're like, are you Catholic? And we're like, no. Not really. Anyway, so here is the inside of the street. So we went onto the bridge and got to walk the bridge. And this is the actual marketplace. So as you can see, we're walking this way. And I just thought it was really cool to have, it just looks like a street, but you're actually over this creek. On a bridge that's been there for a long, long, long time. Here's some smaller versions of that. This is actually someone's house. So we didn't get to go into that one. All right, so here are some important parts for the university. This is where the university professors who would have worked at that university, this is the place they would have lived. So this is where university professors and students, some of the students would have lived. We don't know if Luther actually lived there or not, but whatever. Could have, maybe, sure, possibility. But this is original structure. to the time of Martin Luther. So it's beautiful and well preserved. I mean, clearly they've painted it and kept it up, but as you can see, some of the unevenness of it, because you have different generations of repairs and such. So while in Erfurt, Luther's about to finish his law degree. And while riding in a field one day, he is trapped in a storm. And lightning strikes him and knocks him from the horse. And he falls, and in terror, he cries out in praise to St. Anne. He says, "St. Anne, if you deliver me from this torment, I'll become a monk." That's the story at least, but it's a good story. The very next day, he leaves his career in the law and comes here. This is the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt. This is the main chapel. Again, we could not go in because there were tons of Catholics worshiping inside, because it reverts back. The Augustinians still possess the right to the church, and so that was kind of the thing, was we couldn't go into most of the places that we wanted to in Erfurt because there were Catholics there. And so we were kind of a little bit of a chip on the shoulder, but again, I did poke my head in, because, they're not. If they asked me, "Are you Catholic?" Just genuflect. Wouldn't bother me. Anyway, so we didn't get to go inside, but we did get to see some of the monasteries. So I'll show you the parts that we got to see. We got to see some pretty important parts. So again, here's a view of the monastery from the side, and then this would have been. So this is the kind of entry intake. So Luther would have come to this door, knocked on it, and said, "Hey, I want to be a monk." Now, they didn't just let them in. They would say, "Are you sure?" But not just, "Are you sure?" They're like, "You better be sure." And so what they would do is they would feed them, they would house them, but they had to stay off-site. Not off-site, but over to the side. And this right here, this would have been the guest house for the Augustinian monastery. So these are all now guest rooms, but they would have had other purposes at the time. But this would have been right here, this building. We couldn't go in it because people were literally people were staying in this. Again, you can call the Augustinians and say, "I want to stay in the guest rooms," and people can still do it. You pay for it now, but still. So there was a lot of the Catholic tourism were staying in this monastery. And the refectory where they eat was full of people too. So we couldn't go in there. But anyway, Luther apparently, they don't believe him. So they make him stay in this guest area. Usually you would stay for a little while. They come, they teach you a little bit about what the Augustinians do, and then they ask you, "For real, do you want to be a monk? You don't have to do this. You can come and you can stay and you can learn from us, but you should probably not take vows unless you're serious." They make him stay in there for months. And he does. Because Luther is that guy, right? He's that single-minded about a lot of what he does, especially, in anything, but that's just who he is. He stays for months. He goes through this trial period for months, and finally they say, "Okay, I guess you're not going away. You're serious. Come on in." Now, he takes his vows in that chapel that we saw, that larger church, and he becomes an Augustinian monk. Now, for the Augustinians, and that's a statue of an Augustinian, they had the little shaved part on the crown, little bowl cut. Now, for the Augustinians, life revolved around the bell. Every part of your life was regimented to that chiming of the bell. So you knew where you were, where you had to be, and what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to pray 7 times a day at different things. You would have confession. The life was regimented, and Luther loved it. He loved the order and the structure something to give purpose to his life. And the Augustinians lived by this bell. And this is one of the original bells. Now, little short thing, I know I'm running out of time. The Augustinians, once Erfurt became solidly Protestant, they still let the Augustinians stay there. It was theirs. Like, they got to keep it. But they made the provision until the last Augustinian dies. And then you lose it. It goes to the city. The whole property and everything goes to the city because we're not Catholics. But they also make one altercation. They have to take their bell down. No more ringing of the bell all the time. So how do you want to kill an order that operates themselves over a regimented time schedule? You kill the bell. And that just becomes, like, they don't have clocks. They don't know really how to do it. And they become less and less and less effective as Augustinians. And later, the monastery does eventually close. It is reopened. There's a whole bunch of history that I'm not going to have time to go into. But the Catholic Church does now have ownership of it. The city does sell it back to them on the stipulation that they have to restore it. So the Catholics get it for like $1. They sell it for $1 back to them on the consideration that you have to fix it up. And the Catholics say yes, and the Catholic Church does take ownership of it once again. So now the Catholic Church does take ownership of it. It is restored, but of course they do tours and everything like that. So we are actually up in the place where the monks would have lived in their chambers. And this right here, this is an original stained glass piece to the Augustinian monastery at the time of Luther. And what do you see there? What is that? No, that is not the Luther rose. What is that? It's not a seal. What is that? This is the rose of St. Mary. Where does Luther get his seal? The rose of St. Mary. Remember, when he creates his seal, he's still an Augustinian monk Catholic. He is a professor at the University of Wittenberg, but he is still an Augustinian Catholic, and he uses the rose of St. Mary as the crux of his seal. Later he changes it a little bit. Obviously, he doesn't have the lions. It's a little different, but that's where Luther gets his seal. He takes it from his life in the Augustinian. He would have looked at these windows every day when he was in the monastery, living there. So just, hey, you got to pick something. And now you can see in the back right here. And up there. Yeah. So the symbol that Luther saw every day in the Augustinian monastery, he takes into his life, and now we still have it today. I'll try to finish as fast as I can. This is the confessional room. It's a small chapel on the inside of the Augustinian monastery. The Augustinians did public confession, which is very different from most Roman Catholics. In this public confession, that means that all the brothers would have sat there and listened to the people who would confess their sins. And this is where they said Luther would spend hours confessing sins, and the rest of the monks would get tired of him and very frustrated with him because, seriously, they're like, Martin, no one cares. But it's a cool place to be in, somewhere that they would have done morning devotions and confessions every day. So we sat in a place that Luther would have been in every single day. Yeah, and there's an organ in there they didn't play it, we couldn't touch it, it's old. I wanted to touch it. I got in trouble. Okay, back up, and this is Luther's cell. This would have been where Luther slept and stayed while he was an Augustinian. Yes, it is very roomy. For an Augustinian, right? I remember in the Middle Ages, that's nice digs. But Luther was a rich person, so that would have been a shock for him. Yeah. This is a picture of Luther as an Augustinian. And I'm running out of time, so we'll have to finish this later. But real quick, these are the main cathedrals in